December 6, 1991. A quiet Friday night in Austin, Texas. For teenage girls full of life, full of dreams were closing up a small frozen yogurt shop. But what should have been an ordinary night became a nightmare that would haunt a city for generations. The next morning, the building was in ashes, and inside, the bodies of Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, and Amy Ayers brutally murdered and burned beyond recognition. The community was shattered. The country watched in horror, and police promised justice. But what followed wasn't justice. It was 3 decades of confusion, controversy, and heartbreak. False confessions, wrongful convictions, DNA evidence that didn't match, and a killer who 30 years later still walks free. This is the case that defined a generation of true crime. This is the story of the yogurt shop murders, a cold case still burning, with unanswered questions. Full story. Austin, Texas. December 6, 1991. A chilly Friday night. Christmas lights flickered across neighborhoods. Teenagers gathered at malls. Families settled into weekend routines. But inside a small strip mall on West Anderson Lane, something unimaginable was about to unfold. Just before closing time at a local frozen yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. For teenage girls were wrapping up their night. Eliza Thomas, 17, was a dedicated employee. Jennifer Harbison, also 17, and her younger sister Sarah, 15, were helping out after their school's agricultural fair. The youngest, Amy Ayers, just 13, had tagged along with her friend Jennifer. They were talking, laughing, maybe even making plans for the weekend, completely unaware that someone was watching, waiting. Moments later, the shop would be engulfed in flames. When firefighters arrived at the scene, what they found inside turned a routine fire response into one of the most haunting crime scenes in Texas history. Hidden in the back, through the thick black smoke and charred walls, were the bodies of all 4 girls. Bound, gagged, shot execution style, and in at least one case, sexually assaulted. The youngest, Amy, had been shot twice, the second bullet delivered after the fire had already been lit. It wasn't just murder. It was personal, calculated, cold. The crime shocked the city of Austin and the nation. Parents were terrified. Teens were afraid to leave home. And a city once known for its live music and friendly vibes suddenly found itself living under the shadow of a horrifying mystery. And yet, what followed in the weeks, months, and years after that night may be even more disturbing than the crime itself. The botched investigation, the wrongful arrests, the coerced confessions, the mishandled evidence all painted a picture not just of a horrific crime, but of a justice system unraveling in real time. Who would commit such a savage act? Why? And why, after more than 30 years, is the case still unsolved? Was it a robbery gone wrong or something more sinister? Were the confessions real or forced? Did the justice system imprison innocent men to calm a terrified public? And most haunting of all, could the real killer still be out there? This isn't just a story about 4 young lives cut short. It's a story about injustice, failure, and the long, painful road to truth. It's about science catching up with error, and families refusing to be forgotten. This is the story of the yogurt shop murders, a mystery that's haunted Texas for 3 decades, and a case that might finally be on the brink of being solved. It was a calm Friday evening, just a few weeks before Christmas. Families were out shopping, the streets were lit with holiday decorations, and the city was settling into a peaceful winter rhythm. But at a small frozen yogurt shop tucked into a quiet strip mall, something unthinkable was about to take place. The shop was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, a popular after-school hangout and part-time job for local teens. That evening, 4 young girls were there. Eliza Thomas, 17, was working her regular shift. Alongside her were Jennifer Harbison, also 17, and her younger sister Sarah, 15. Joining them was Amy Ayers, just 13 years old, who had stopped by to spend time with her friend Jennifer. By all accounts, it was a normal night. The girls cleaned up the store, likely chatted about school or weekend plans, and began preparing to close around 11:45 p.m. The atmosphere would have felt safe, routine, even, but unknown to them, something ominous was unfolding just beyond those glass doors. Sometime before midnight, emergency services received a call. The yogurt shop was on fire. Firefighters arrived quickly and extinguished the flames. But what they discovered inside the building turned a routine response into one of the most disturbing cases in Texas history. Behind the counter and in the back room, the remains of all 4 girls were found. The scene was devastating. This was no accident. This was a violent crime, and the community would never be the same. What began as a small fire turned into a full-scale homicide investigation. law enforcement immediately launched one of the largest and most complex manhunts in Austin's history. Hundreds of tips were called in. Interviews were conducted. Investigators combed the scene for clues, but the damage from the fire made evidence collection difficult. The water and smoke had compromised vital details. It was a race against time and the unknown. The city, once known for its charm and calm, was now on edge. Parents were terrified. Teens were shaken. How could this happen to four girls who had done nothing wrong, who were simply closing up a small yogurt shop on a Friday night? Despite their efforts, the initial investigation offered few clear answers. Sketches were released of possible suspects seen nearby, but they led nowhere. There was no conclusive evidence, no solid lead. And although many suspected robbery, the motives behind the crime remained murky and unsettling. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were left in unimaginable pain. Austin mourned as a community, but the question lingered in every household. Who could have done this and why? The yogurt shop case became national news. It gripped the public with fear, confusion, and outrage. The horror of what happened wasn't just in the crime itself, but in the silence that followed. Months passed, then years, and still, there were no arrests. But as the years ticked by, the need for answers only grew stronger. This was no longer just a case, it was a wound in the heart of a city, waiting to heal. What happened on that quiet night in December wasn't just a crime, it was the start of a decades-long pursuit for truth, accountability, and justice. And for the families of the victims, the nightmare was only just beginning. In the days following the tragedy at the yogurt shop, Austin, Texas was shaken to its core. This was a city known for its music, its energy, and its small-town warmth despite being a growing metropolis. But now, it was gripped by something it hadn't felt in a long time: fear. Schools, churches, and coffee shops buzzed with speculation. Who could have done something so terrible? And more importantly, why? For young girls, all with bright futures, had lost their lives in a place where children often gathered for after-school treats. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. The Austin Police Department formed a dedicated task force. Every available detective was brought in to help. Flyers were distributed. Witnesses were interviewed. A reward fund was quickly created with donations pouring in from local businesses and citizens alike. The community wanted answers. They wanted justice. But the investigation faced serious obstacles right from the beginning. The fire that had been set to cover up the crime had destroyed or contaminated much of the evidence. Fire hoses had washed away key materials, and the crime scene was chaotic in those first critical hours. Without security cameras, and with few eyewitnesses, detectives were working almost entirely in the dark. Still, they pushed forward. Investigators began looking into every possible angle: robbery, personal vendettas, random violence. They reviewed known offenders in the area. They questioned local teens. They even examined cases in other states, wondering if this attack was part of a pattern. The media quickly picked up the story, broadcasting updates across the country. Headlines read like something from a horror novel. The pressure on law enforcement was enormous. They needed a breakthrough, and fast. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, that breakthrough never came. False tips flooded in. People claimed to have seen suspicious men near the shop. Others reported hearing noises or seeing flames. Some of the leads were credible, many were not. And the more time passed, the harder it became to separate fact from fiction. Meanwhile, the families of Eliza, Amy, Jennifer, and Sarah were thrust into an and no one had been held accountable. By the end of the first year, the investigation had stalled. People began to wonder, would this case ever be solved? But just when hope seemed to fade, new names began to surface, and with them came a turn in the case that no one saw coming. Years had passed, the families were still waiting, the city of Austin still searching for answers. Then in 1999, nearly 8 years after the murders, police made a stunning announcement. 4 suspects had been identified. The men were all in their early 20s. Their names were Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Morris Pierce, and Forrest Welburn. All 4 had been teenagers at the time of the crime, and all of them had once attended the same local high school. For the first time in almost a decade, the public believed justice might finally be served. But what unfolded next would raise more questions than it answered. The confessions? Detectives claimed that during hours-long interrogations, 2 of the suspects, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, had confessed to the crime. The details in their confessions were graphic, specific, and deeply disturbing. Authorities believed these statements were enough to finally make arrests, and they did. But there was a problem. Actually, several. First, the confessions didn't match each other. Key details, like who did what and when, were inconsistent. Some elements directly contradicted crime scene evidence. Others seemed to mirror details that had already been made public. Second, there was no physical evidence linking any of the suspects to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, nothing that independently verified their involvement. And most troubling of all, defense attorneys and investigators would later claim that these confessions had been coerced, pulled from the suspects during intense, lengthy interrogations, sometimes without lawyers present. Michael Scott, in particular, was questioned for hours, sometimes while alone, and under emotional pressure. In one taped session, he appeared nervous and confused, even physically intimidated. Still, despite the concerns, prosecutors moved forward. In 2001, Robert Springsteen was convicted and sentenced to death. 1 year later, Michael Scott received a life sentence. For many, this should have been the end. The case was closed, but the cracks were already starting to show. DNA changes everything. Around this same time, DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Forensic scientists tested biological evidence from the scene, including a sample that appeared to belong to an unknown male. That DNA did not match Springsteen. It didn't match Scott. It didn't match Pierce or Welburn. In fact, it didn't match anyone in the National DNA Database. This was critical. If none of the 4 suspects matched the DNA found on key evidence, then who did? And if their confessions were the only thing tying them to the case, could they be trusted? By 2006, public confidence in the convictions had plummeted. Civil liberties groups, legal experts, and even some former law enforcement officers began questioning the case. A new district attorney reopened the investigation. 3 years later, in 2009, the convictions of both Springsteen and Scott were officially overturned. All charges against the 4 men were dropped. The case was once again cold. The families, who had once believed they were close to justice, were devastated. The community was confused, and the investigation, now spanning nearly 2 decades, was back at square one. So where did this leave the case? If not these 4 men, then who? With the release of Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott in 2009, the public's attention shifted, not just to who committed the yogurt shop murders, but to a more painful question: did the system get it all wrong? This case, once hailed as solved, was now wide open again. And as new evidence surfaced, the cracks in the original investigation turned into gaping holes. DNA vs. confessions. Let's go back to the DNA. After years of testing, the crime scene produced a male DNA profile. But it didn't match any of the 4 accused. Not Springsteen, not Scott, not Pierce, not Welburn. This was critical. The DNA came from a location connected to the assault. And if it didn't match the suspects, how could they be guilty? And then came the larger issue, the confessions themselves. Legal experts began to examine them closely. Both Springsteen and Scott were interrogated for hours, without legal counsel and under questionable conditions. Some portions of the confession tapes were never recorded. Others showed interviewers leading the suspects with subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hints about what they should say. Psychologists, lawyers, and investigative journalists began to suggest what was once unthinkable: that these confessions could have been false. Springsteen later said he confessed because he believed it was the only way out. He thought if he gave them what they wanted, it would stop. Michael Scott described a similar pressure of being alone, exhausted, and pushed to say things he didn't understand. What began to emerge was a chilling possibility. The case had been built almost entirely on statements made under duress, and nothing else. The public starts to ask questions. News outlets began running documentaries and deep dives into the investigation. Podcasts and online forums exploded with theories, and with every detail exposed, public opinion shifted. Some called for a full inquiry into how the police handled the case. Others pointed out that the pressure to solve such a high-profile crime may have led to rushed judgment. And most heartbreaking of all, the victims' families were once again in limbo, back where they started nearly 2 decades earlier. No convictions, no new suspects, no closure, a broken system. The case became a textbook example in legal circles, not just of a crime unsolved, but of justice mishandled. How could a confession outweigh forensic evidence? Why weren't stronger safeguards in place during interrogations? And how many other cases might be affected by the same tactics? For some, the answer was systemic failure. For others, It was a painful reminder that even well-intentioned detectives can make critical mistakes under pressure. Meanwhile, the unknown male DNA still sat in a national database, a silent clue, waiting to match someone. But with no hits and no new leads, the case drifted back into cold case files. But not for long, because just as it seemed the trail had gone cold forever, a new wave of forensic science was on the horizon, and it promised something the case had never truly had: real, verifiable evidence. By the early 2010s, the yogurt shop murders had officially returned to cold case status. The convictions were overturned, the original suspects were free, and no one else had been arrested. For many, it seemed the truth would remain buried forever. But then, science began catching up with justice. New advancements in forensic technology were offering fresh hope, not just in Austin, Texas, but across the world. And for the families of the 4 victims, that hope was all they had left. A second look at the evidence. In 2011, investigators made a crucial decision. They would retest the physical evidence from the original crime scene using modern DNA methods. Among the items re-examined were clothing, store materials, and samples recovered from the bodies of the victims. The goal was simple: to find anything that modern science could identify that older techniques missed. And that's when something extraordinary happened. A single male DNA profile, consistent with previous findings, was confirmed again. But this time, the test was more precise. This DNA did not match any of the 4 men previously charged. It didn't match anyone in the FBI's CODIS system. It belonged to someone unknown. But the fact that it was still there, preserved and verifiable after all these years, meant one thing: the real killer might still be caught. The rise of genetic genealogy. Around this same time, a new technique was changing the world of cold cases: genetic genealogy. Popularized by the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, this method used public DNA databases, like GEDmatch, to trace suspects through family trees. For the yogurt shop case, it raised a bold possibility. Could they finally identify the unknown male through his distant relatives? Investigators hinted that they were working with private labs and genealogical researchers. But unlike other cases, this one had a unique challenge. The DNA sample, while usable, was still limited in quality, and the suspect's possible lack of family history in databases made things even harder. Still, there was momentum. For the first time in years, the case wasn't stuck. It was moving slowly, methodically, toward answers. Hope for the families. For the victims' families, this new forensic approach brought a quiet, cautious hope. They had seen leads come and go, false confessions, dropped charges, media storms. But this was different. DNA doesn't lie. And if this sample could one day lead to a suspect, even decades later, it would finally bring the closure they had been denied for so long. Eliza Thomas, Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, and Amy Ayers, for girls with futures ahead of them, had been reduced to a headline. But science was helping restore their voices. The path forward wouldn't be fast, but for the first time in decades, it felt possible. Justice, real justice, might still be out there. Behind every crime, beyond every headline, are the lives that were lost, and the people they left behind. The yogurt shop murders are often told through the lens of confusion, injustice, and investigation. But to truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we have to pause and remember the 4 girls whose lives were stolen that night. Their names were Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, and Amy Ayers. They weren't just victims of a crime. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They had dreams, hobbies, quirks, and futures that were just beginning. Eliza Thomas, age 17. Eliza was a high school student who loved music and drawing. Friends say she was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply compassionate. She had plans to go to college, maybe study psychology or art. She was working that night, closing the shop, doing what most teenagers do, earning a little money and gaining independence. Jennifer Harbison, age 17. Jennifer was strong, focused, and protective, especially of her younger sister, Sarah. She played sports, made good grades, and worked hard at her job. On the night of the tragedy, she was also working her shift. She had driven her sister and their friend Amy to the shop, expecting a normal Friday night. Sarah Harbison, age 15. Sarah was the youngest Harbison sister, bubbly, energetic, and curious about the world. She adored her sister, and the two were nearly inseparable. Sarah wasn't supposed to be at the shop that night, but she wanted to keep Jennifer company. That decision would cost her everything. Amy Ayers, age 13. Amy was the youngest of all. Just 13 years old. She loved animals and wanted to become a veterinarian. Her presence at the yogurt shop was spontaneous. She was simply hanging out with her friend Jennifer. Amy was the last to be found, and forensic evidence revealed she fought to the end. Her courage in her final moments is nothing short of heartbreaking. Families who never gave up. In the aftermath of the murders, the families were shattered, but not silent. They demanded justice. They sat through hearings, trials, reversals, media storms, and years of silence. Even when the case went cold again, they kept pushing. Some of them still live in Austin. Others moved away, trying to escape the shadows of that December night. But every year, on the anniversary of the murders, they return. Vigils are held, candles are lit. The names of the girls are read aloud, not as victims, but as people. More than a case file, to the public, this may be one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. But to the people who knew Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy, it was personal. These girls never got to graduate, never got to fall in love, never got to see adulthood. They were robbed of every moment that was still waiting for them. And that's why this story still matters. It's not just about solving a mystery. It's about honoring for lives that were unjustly taken and making sure they are never forgotten. As the investigation dragged on and answers remained elusive, the media stepped in, first as a megaphone for justice, and later as a mirror reflecting public frustration. From the very beginning, the yogurt shop murders captivated national headlines. For teenage girls brutally murdered in a popular family-friendly shop, it was a nightmare no community wanted to imagine. The media quickly latched onto the case, and the public couldn't look away. The power of the press. Local newspapers in Austin ran emotional front-page stories. Television crews covered every police press conference. When the arrests were made in 1999, nearly a decade after the murders, the media treated it like justice was finally served. Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were paraded on TV. Their confessions, though later proven problematic, were broadcast everywhere. Many in the public breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they thought, the monsters have names. But that relief wouldn't last. When doubt entered the headlines, as defense attorneys revealed inconsistencies, and DNA evidence failed to match, the media narrative began to shift. What was once a story of resolution became a story of error, injustice, and doubt. News outlets questioned the interrogation methods, highlighting how both Scott and Springsteen were subjected to intense, arguably coercive questioning. Their taped confessions became not just evidence, but exhibits in a broader debate about false confessions and police pressure. Talk shows, opinion pieces, and podcasts asked the same questions. Were the wrong people convicted? Was the case rushed to satisfy public demand? Could the real killer still be out there? The rise of true crime media. In the 2010s and 2020s, true crime exploded in popularity, and the yogurt shop murders found a new audience. Podcasts like Crime Junkie, Unsolved, and others began dissecting the case. YouTube channels covered every twist and turn. Reddit forums analyzed court documents, timelines, and witness statements. The story wasn't just alive, it was viral. In 2024, an HBO Max docuseries reignited global attention. Through archival footage, emotional interviews, and never-before-seen evidence, the series gave viewers something new: empathy. Not just for the girls, but for the families, the wrongly accused, and even the investigators who were haunted by their mistakes. A divided public. But the spotlight also brought division. Some believed the original suspects were guilty, that the overturned convictions were the result of legal technicalities. Others saw the men as victims themselves, caught in a system more interested in closure than truth. What united everyone, however, was a shared feeling of injustice. Whether it was the wrong men being punished, or the right killer walking free, something had gone horribly wrong. Media pressure versus justice. The yogurt shop case is a chilling reminder of how public opinion, fueled by media, can shape investigations, trials, and even verdicts. Sometimes for good, sometimes for harm. The real question remains, in the pursuit of justice, did the media help or hurt? It's been more than 30 years since 4 teenage girls were murdered in a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. Decades of heartbreak, false starts, and shattered lives, and yet, this case remains unsolved. But that doesn't mean it's forgotten. A new era of forensics. In recent years, investigators have turned to advanced DNA technology, hoping it can succeed where traditional detective work failed. Using techniques like touch DNA and genetic genealogy, cold case units have revisited the evidence, including the infamous crime scene where the girls were found. The most significant clue remains: an unidentified male DNA profile found on Amy Ayers, the youngest victim. This DNA does not match any of the original suspects. In fact, it doesn't match anyone in current US criminal databases. And yet, it exists. A genetic ghost, silently waiting to be identified. With the success of tools like GetMatch and Parabon Nanolabs, the same technologies that helped catch the Golden State Killer may finally break this case wide open. Still an active investigation. The Austin Police Department insists the case is still active. They've formed partnerships with federal agencies and outside labs to keep pushing forward. Every year, new tips come in. Some are dead ends, others promising. But so far, no arrests. Still, investigators remain hopeful. All it takes is one family member, one relative, submitting their DNA to a genealogy site, and everything could change overnight. Public pressure matters. Thanks to renewed media interest, especially after the 2024 HBO docuseries, public pressure is once again mounting. The families of Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy continue to speak out, urging law enforcement to keep the case alive. They've waited long enough. 30 years is too long to wait for answers, and even longer to wait for peace. Why this case still matters? This case is more than a crime scene or a cold file. It's a symbol of the cracks in the justice system, of the danger of rushing to judgment, and of the incredible pain that happens when the truth remains just out of reach. It reminds us that real people suffer when justice is delayed, that even the most high-profile cases can falter without proper care, and that persistence, community, and science are the only paths forward. With every new forensic advance, with every piece of re-examined evidence, we move closer to the truth. And when that day finally comes, when the name behind that DNA profile is discovered, justice will not only be served, it will be remembered. If this story moved you, subscribe to stay updated on the case. The yogurt shop murders may still be unsolved, but together, by keeping the story alive, we can help push it forward. Because these 4 girls deserve answers. And we're not giving up.